This week, we're going to be talking about knife making, specifically the blades. Blades are made in two different ways when it comes to making knives, primarily two different ways. The first way is through forging. The second way is through stock removal. There's definitely a demarcation line between the two. Some knife makers will go to forging, some will go to stock removal, and there's really nothing in between. You're going to have one or the other. So forging or stock removal, which one is better? How are they different? What are they? We're going to explore that today in this video. Well, welcome to my kitchen. So we're talking about the difference between making blades using a forging process and a stock removal process. Let's tackle forging first. I just so happen to have a Wusthof knife right here, and this is a really good example of closed die or impression forging. Now this is different from open die forging, but we're going to tackle this first. Closed die is when you take the steel, a plug of steel or a billet, you're going to place it into a forge, which is basically an oven with a whole bunch of fire in it. And you're going to heat that steel up to a critical temperature where you can move the steel. It has to be a very particular temperature. Then you pull it out when it's ready and you place it onto an anvil. And above the anvil you have a hammer. Now, in the case of a closed die or impression forging, that anvil is going to have a shape or a die cut into it. And then the hammer is going to have the same thing. So when you place the blade on there and the hammer comes down, it will forge it into the shape that you're looking for. Now you can make obviously a lot of blades much more quickly that way. It's generally used for production knives. As a matter of fact, if you look at what Wusthof sent us, they sent us a nice example of the forging process or the steps that the blade goes through when it goes through the forging process. But this is a good example right here. This is my own Wusthof knife. I use this all the time. And you see this bolster here, this area right here. This is all one piece of steel, all the way down to the bolster area or the pommel area, all the way up through the heel of the knife, all the way up to the tip. This is one piece of steel. And this shape is made in there using a closed cell or impression forging process, right? This is generally what you're going to see. Now there are some variations to this, and we're going to explore those in the future with different manufacturers. But this is primarily what you're going to see in manufactured knives, where they have to do larger numbers of knives and they need to be much faster. Now the other way of doing it is with an open die. So open die is going to be a little bit different, but very similar. When we forge using an open die, again, we're going to heat up that steel to a critical temperature, and then we're going to bring it to an anvil. Once the steel is ready to move, we'll bring it to an anvil. We'll take a hammer, just like they've done for thousands of years now, and you're going to hammer that shape out of the steel. But now what they do these days, you don't have a lot of guys that have that arm that are willing to go out there and hammer on the steel all day long. So they use what's called a trip hammer. And this trip hammer will have a bar on the bottom of it where you press it down with your foot. And the farther you press that bar down, the faster the hammer comes down on an anvil. So the anvil is already there. You can change the shape of the anvil by installing different shapes. And the hammer is the same way. You could change the shape of the hammer as well, so you'll be able to do what it is you're looking to do. But as you press down that foot pedal, that hammer comes down faster and faster, and you're able to get a lot more hammer strokes in before the piece of steel cools and it stops moving. So it's a faster way of forging the blade. Works just as good as hammering it out with a hammer on an old-fashioned anvil, but much faster. This is typically what you're going to find the custom knife makers using when they're using the forging process to make a blade. They're going to hammer it using a trip hammer. And they'll use presses as well. Now a press will come down and press the steel into a shape that you're looking for. And there's reasons to use that and a time to use that. But they'll also go back and forth between a press and a hammer. And that big hammer will actually hammer it into shape. They normally will take a handle and they'll weld it onto the piece of steel, whether it's a billet or it's a plug of steel, and they'll weld it onto that so that they can stay further back so they don't get too hot. They can stand further back, pull that hot steel out of the forge, which is the oven that brings it up to temperature, and place it onto the anvil and then hammer it into the shape they're looking for. So open cell is where you're actually using a hammer and an anvil, but it doesn't have the dies cut into it. It's not a shape already cut into it. You're actually freehanding the shaping of that blade. Closed cell or impression forging is where you have a die cut on either side, and the big machine will come down and hammer that into the shape you're looking for, and you can make the exact same shape over and over and over again. So those are the two different forms of forging a knife. In either one, you're still going to use hammer and anvil, and you're going to heat that steel up to a critical temperature, or a temperature by which you can move the steel. You know, I could try and explain this to you all day long, but Steve out at Ironman Forge can explain it a lot better than I can, and he can actually show you. He's a great knife maker out there. Steve, if you're out there, can you show these nice folks what the forge looks like, what the trip hammer looks like and how that works, and how the press works as well, and the difference between the press and the forge and when you use each. And yeah, by the way, if y'all want to get anything from Steve, buy one of his knives. His information is going to be down below.
Hey y'all, it's Steve from Ironman Forge. So you want to know the difference between a hammer and a press and how to use them. I'm working a piece of sand mite today, which is 3 pieces of steel, stainless outside, carbon core. I've welded them together, and now I'm stretching that piece out, and I'm using both my hammer and my press to do so. There's the piece of stock that I'm working, and then I'm going to bring that over here. This is the press. The press has one function: squeeze. This is a 50-ton press, so it's got 100,000 pounds of pressure. It's got a foot pedal. Runs it up, squeeze it, let off. This is to straighten, smash, square everything up. The hammer, just what it says, it goes up and down. So let's see if we can't get something hammered out for you. So here's what I'm starting with today. I'm making sanmai. Sanmai is a Japanese term. Basically, I'm taking 3 pieces of steel and making 1 piece out of it. So if you look down here on the desk, I've got 2 pieces of stainless and a piece of carbon steel. I'm gonna set that carbon steel in the middle. I'm gonna put the 2 pieces of stainless on the outside. I'm gonna weld them up. So I'm gonna take my welder and I'm gonna weld that seam all the way around so that I don't have any air gaps. And once I don't have air gaps, then I'm gonna heat it up in the forge, 2200 degrees. I'm gonna hammer it out. I'm gonna stretch it and make a billet out of it, and then make a 14-inch chef's knife out of it, a brisket cutter.
I really appreciate it. Boy, I tell you what, if you want a great knife, you want to have a knife made, Steve is definitely your guy. His information is down below in the comments. Feel free to give him a shout. All right, so we've talked about the forge process and the difference between open cell and closed cell forging or impression forging. Let's talk about stock removal. Stock removal is very much like sculpting. If you're Michelangelo and you're sculpting David, when that big rock came in, that big hunk of, I guess it's made out of marble or maybe another type of stone, doesn't matter. Anyways, when that big rock came in, Michelangelo took a look at the rock and he proceeded to remove everything that wasn't David, right? If you don't know what his David is, then look it up online. But you remove what's not what you want. In the case of knives, you're removing everything that's not the shape of the knife that you want to leave. So you're sculpting a knife blade out of steel. Now the steel typically comes in billets. Billets can be at different lengths and different widths. its dimension at the place that makes the steel, at the forge that makes the steel. We're going to explore that in future videos as well. But you get the billet in, or sheets. When manufacturers get a little bit bigger, they get it in larger sheets. And then they will cut out of the billet or the sheet, they will cut out the profile of the knife, the shape of the knife. And then from there, they're going to remove the bevels of the knife. Whether it's hollow ground, flat ground, convex grind, whatever type of grind they want to use, they will cut out or sculpt the knife out of the piece of steel, the billet or the sheet or what they've dimensioned. So they're cutting out that blade and they're shaping it. Oftentimes the smaller makers will do this freehand. Other times you have smaller manufacturers, they'll use CNC machines to do this. Whereas they'll go in and they'll program it in a program, a three-dimensional program, and then the machine itself will take up the blade, place it into a mill, and then it will grind that steel away that's not knife, and it will shape that blade the way they want to shape it. So either way is considered stock removal, whether you do it in a CNC machine or whether you do it by hand on a belt sander. You're removing material, you're sculpting that steel in order to make that blade. Now there's advantages to this over forging. There's advantages of forging over stock removal. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but you know the best person to talk about stock removal is Chris over at Bordertown Blades. Chris, are you out there? Could you show these folks what stock removal is all about? Show them how the billet comes in and then what you do to it in order to turn it into a knife blade?
Hey everybody, I'm Chris with Bordertown Blades. And Richard, it is so great to have an opportunity to talk with you and everybody else about stock removal versus forging. So I'm a stock removal knife maker. I don't swing a hammer, I don't use a forge, I'm not doing that level of artistry. Not that what I do doesn't have a skill set to it, it's kind of a different animal. I've heard it said that a guy who does stock removal will grind and a guy who forges will swing a hammer and grind. So we all end up kind of grinding a little bit in the end. The great thing about stock removal is when I get a piece of steel or a sheet of steel, I don't have to worry about drawing it out, messing up the grain, overheating it, doing things like that until I'm in the heat treat process. And I know Richard was talking about billets and sheets of steel. So when I talk about a sheet of steel, what I'm talking about is something like this. So this is AVL steel, it's about 1/8 of an inch thick. And what I do for stock removal is I will draw up a knife. That's kind of what these are supposed to be. And I will cut them out either with a plasma cutter or with a small portaband saw, a small saw. And that lets me cut through the metal and I can cut a rough shape out for the blade. I can't draw. When I talk about a billet, what I'm talking about is not a mono piece of steel, but a piece of Damascus or sand mine or something that's much more complex. Billets are usually much smaller, and I don't know if I'm using the right terminology in the right place. It's just, that's how the manufacturers have sold me the two different. So, like this came from Ballbach Damast in Germany. If I'm not hand cutting each blade out, which I do for my custom knives, if it's the knives that are my production knives, like what you'll find at Bear Claw Knife and Shear, I get those blades, I buy the steel, and then I get the blade, my design, cut out with a water jet. So there's holes cut in them, they come in very similar to this. They haven't been heat treated yet. And then I'll go through and I'll clean them up, I'll profile them, I'll do different things to them as needed. I heat treat all of my blades as before I grind them. And I know different people do it different ways, but this is my preferred method because I feel I'm getting constant contact with my quenching plates if I heat treat before I grind it. And I'm less likely to warp the blade because I haven't been heating it up or doing anything. It just means I'm going to go through more sanding belts and it's going to be a little bit harder to grind them. Let me show you when we're talking about removing metal. So a forging guy, he can pound in that bevel, that line. He can get it pretty close. It's amazing what some of these talented makers can do. So they're pounding everything in. Well, I'm at a set thickness here, and I've got to take that down to actually have a knife. So my method, and there's a lot of different guys who have a lot of different ways of doing it. I freehand grind everything. So I wear these gloves. They're about, I don't know, they're 5 or 6 years old at this point. And I just glue leather on my fingers so they're stuck in place. And I'm gonna take a knife like this, and I'm gonna figure out where I want my line to start. I'm gonna find my center line, and I'm gonna grind it. So when I grind, we'll be at about the 7 o'clock position on the belt. So I keep a bucket because I don't want to heat my blade up at all. So we keep it wet. We got one side almost done. Now we'll hit this other side. One more pass, and we should have our initial grind really good. I like to try and keep a thickness thinner than a dime. So I got a nice, I'm centered. My 2 points right here are lined up pretty well. My 2 points back here are lined up pretty well. That's noisy. And this gives us a nice clean grind. So we're gonna have a few more steps to go through. I won't torture you guys with that, but that's kind of the essence of stock removal. We're able to remove a lot of material really quickly. We're able to do some really finite shaping of the handle. The downside is like I said, they can draw out metal. We don't get to draw stuff out, so we just have a lot of byproducts. So there's a lot of weight or burned up steel that comes off of the grinder. That's stock removal in a nutshell. Make sure you check out Bordertown Blades at bcknife.com, at bordertownblades.com. If you have any questions about stock removal or about knife making, feel free to reach out to me at Bordertown Blades, or talk to Richard, or even go to one of the Bear Claw Knife and Shear knife talks that they've had going on. It's a great opportunity to learn a bit about knives, cutlery, and see what those guys have happening in their store. It's amazing there.
Chris, I appreciate it so much. I tell you what, folks, we're going to leave Chris's information down below, Chris with Bordertown Blades. He makes some great knives. We have many of them in stock right now, so if you'd like to take a look at his knives, you could do that in the store. I believe we have them online as well at bcknife.com, so if you'd like to see some of what we have, of course, you're welcome to go to bcknife.com and buy some knives from us. It would certainly help us do more of these videos. I really appreciate it, Chris. Chris makes a great knife, but all you're really doing in the stock removal process is you're removing what's not the knife. And that takes a lot of skill and a lot of artistry, just like forging process does. Now, which is better? Forging a knife or stock removal? This has been an argument between knife makers forever, since knives are being made. There's a whole lot of folks that insist that you're not making a knife unless you forge that blade. There's a whole lot of people that say that stock removal is better. And I'll tell you why they say that. It's because some of the higher end steels that are coming out now, especially powdered steel, it's difficult to forge. You typically don't see people trying to forge with that. Because I tell you what, forging a blade, that hammer comes down hard with tons of force. And these powdered steels that are coming out these days, these higher tech steels, are very hard right out of the factory. I mean, they're tough steels. And you don't typically see a forge hammering on these types of steels. But these steels are amazing. They're just amazing. But typically you're going to see people using stock removal in order to use these new high-tech steels that are coming out. So, you know, is forging better than in stock removal? I don't think so. I think both are just as good for their own reasons. Now, occasionally you'll see a knife maker that buys their blades from someone else, from one of these supply houses. They'll put a handle on it, and then they'll go out to your local knife and gun show, and they'll say that they're making the knives when they clearly aren't. And that I take exception to. You know, God bless them, there's a place for those folks, and certainly if they want to do that, that's fine. I love shaping handles too. But really, to be a true knife maker, to pay that high dollar for a knife, you want a knife maker that's either using the forging process or using stock removal in order to make their knives. Now, regardless of forging or stock removal, the way you compare one knife to another is by using 4 properties. Now, I've talked about this in other videos that we've done. The 4 properties we use to measure one knife blade from another is toughness, corrosion resistance, edge retention, and sharpenability. Toughness, corrosion resistance, edge retention, and sharpenability. You take a look at those 4 properties, and that's how you compare one steel to another, or how you compare one blade to another blade. You can get incredible properties out of forging a knife. You can get incredible properties out of stock removal. But that's the way we're going to measure each. So one more thing I wanted to talk about, and that's Damascus knives. Because of that show, Forged in Fire, it's really brought a lot of attention to knife making and done great things for the knife industry. Single-handedly, it's rejuvenated the knife world and brought a lot of attention to knife makers and what they do. Damascus is seen a lot in that show, and a lot of people have a lot of interest in Damascus. And people ask me all the time, is Damascus the best steel out there? Well, Damascus is just a process by which we use 2 different steels or more, and we weld them together, we forge them together, and then we twist them or fold them to create that design in the steel. So it depends on what steel we're using in the Damascus as to whether it's going to be good or bad. If you use 2 different types of steel and those steels are lousy, it's going to be a lousy Damascus. If it's not forged together well, there's going to be voids in there, there's going to be gaps between the steel that don't forge together, that don't weld together well. This is very typically what you see in a lot of Pakistani knives. You have to be careful. Some Chinese knives, although they've improved a lot over the years, Pakistan is now beginning to improve. We actually have one company we're doing business with that actually makes a fairly nice Damascus knife. And we're going to be going out to visit with them. Once I get up the nerve to go out to Pakistan, we're going to go visit with them and see how they forge their knives. But it's 2 different steels that are forged together and then folded or twisted to make the blade. Now we have 2 different types of Damascus. We have stainless steel Damascus, which is 2 different stainless steels, or a tool steel and a stainless, and those are welded together and folded. Or we have carbon steel Damascus, where you have a carbon steel and typically a tool steel that is folded together to make a Damascus. Now, a carbon steel will have no chromium in it, so it will have no rust resistance. This is typically what you'll see out of Pakistan, and what a lot of custom knife makers make, very nice carbon steel Damascus. And it'll tend to have a darker color than the stainless steel Damascus. I think we've had examples of that here. If you look at this side by side, you'll see the difference between the look of a stainless steel Damascus and a carbon steel Damascus. Both Damascus can be very, very good or very, very bad. It really depends on who's making them. Anything you get at Bear Claw, which by the way, the store is in Midland, Texas, or you can find us at bcknife.com. Just a plug there for us. Anything you find with us is going to be a real Damascus. Now there are cases often when people will just put a design on the outside of the blade and make you think it's a Damascus when it's not, but you won't find that in our store. Everything that we have that looks like Damascus is real Damascus. So Damascus can be a great thing. Damascus is always forged. You're always putting that under a trip hammer. You're always folding it or twisting it. You're always making 2 different steels forged together and folded or twisted to make that blade. So you have the properties of a forged blade. But again, like anything else, just because it's Damascus doesn't mean it's always good. All right, so it's kind of getting late. I'm beginning to lose my light here in the kitchen. I want to thank you for watching the video. I want to thank Chris with Bordertown Blades and Steve with Iron Man Forge for helping us out on this video. Really appreciate it. Two great knife makers there. Again, their information is down below. And do me a favor, give me one of those thumbs up. And then if you haven't subscribed yet, if you will do so, that would be great. Both of those things. And if you put a comment down below, and I expect a lot of comments out of this video, if you put a comment down below, it helps us with the algorithm, and YouTube will do a better job of promoting our video. We need all the help we can get. It's very expensive to do these videos, especially when I travel to different knife makers around the country and soon to be around the world. Very expensive. And to do this, we need your help. We need you to do that. And we need you to go to bcknife.com and buy something. I don't care if it's a $20 something or other. If you buy something at bcknife.com, it keeps us in a position where we can do these videos. Again, it's very expensive. Really appreciate you watching. If you got any questions, put them down below in the comments. I read all our comments. Until next time, we'll see you then.